Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. It is January 24th, 2017. My name is John DeLynn, and we are here to interview someone who I think is I would say she's a pioneer in modern Mormonism. That's just my bias. But she's been involved in all sorts of really important things. Her name is Nadine Hansen. Or Nadine McCombs Hansen?
McCombs.
McCombs. And let me just list a few of the reasons why I think you'll be interested in Nadine. Nadine, she's been a member of the church her whole life, but she was around enough to sort of have been raised in the church, to have experienced the Equal Rights Amendment sort of, issues related to the church in the late 70s. She became aware of Sunstone and Dialogue. Around that time, she's been involved in publishing articles for Dialogue and for Sunstone, and being involved in Sunstone presentations for a long time. She's been, I would say, an activist for LGBT rights within the church for decades, but also for feminism in the church and female ordination. But she's also fascinating because she obtained a law degree while she was a Mormon mom, and her legal work, interestingly enough, has been to sort of act as a protector to the children of FLDS families, and we'll talk more about that as well. But she's served as the guardian ad litem. Is that right?
I've been a guardian ad litem in a couple of cases involving FLDS children, but in a broader sense too, children in a number of different kinds of situations.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And she's just been a really active participant in everything that's been going on. Incidentally, her daughter is Laura Compton, who I started a group called Mormons for Marriage Equality, or Mormons for Equality, way back in the day. And then her son-in-law is Todd Compton, the author of a few books, but In Sacred Loneliness will be one that a lot of people are aware of. So there's just so much to talk about with Nadine. If you guys have seen my interview with Carolyn Pearson or Bill Bradshaw or Christine Jepson Clark, it's one of those epic stories. This will definitely be a multi-hour interview, and it's just going to dig deep into the life of someone who's just really been involved in progressive Mormon thought and activism for multiple decades. Now, Nadine, first of all, welcome to Mormon Stories.
Thank you.
Do you want to correct the record? Is there anything that I got wrong?
Well, you may have overstated a few things, but the general outline is definitely correct.
All right. Well, we're excited to have you here. We are broadcasting this live, so if there's anyone who is listening to the live stream, we love it when people make comments or ask questions on the live stream, so we just want to invite people to feel free to do that to the extent that they're interested. So, all right, Nadine, so we're going to be covering a lot, but let's jump in with your kind of Mormon childhood. Tell us a bit about your upbringing in the church.
Okay, I was born in Southern California, in the San Fernando Valley, right at the early part of the beginning of the baby boom. I was born in 1947. 46 is the first year of the baby boom. So I grew up there in Southern California. My parents were married in the temple, in the Salt Lake Temple. I was born quite a few years later because they were married before the war and had one child before the war, and then I came along after. We were always active in the church in terms of like going to Sunday school every week. But my parents were not really fanatical Mormons by any means. And they were really good people. I had great parents. And my grandmother lived with us. Her husband had died right a few years after my parents had gotten married. And they lived up in Idaho at the time. And then my dad, you know, they lived through the Depression. And then as they were coming out of the Depression, World War II was starting, and my dad got a job down in Burbank at the Lockheed aircraft plant there. He went out to California before my mom did, and then she came out, and my grandmother came. And at the beginning of World War II, my dad was working building aircraft for the war effort at Lockheed, so they didn't particularly want him to leave that work to join the military. But eventually he was going to be drafted, and so he joined the Army. At that point, my brother was probably a couple years old, and my mother went to work at Lockheed as a Rosie the Riveter, and my grandmother did also. So they both worked there, and just as a societal point, at that point, many of the men had gone off to war. The women were needed in the factories, and the government supported them by I think they had daycare on site. So they did what they needed to do to get women into the workforce. And then at the end of the war, the men came back, and the men needed the jobs, and they wanted the women to go home. And there was a big push to have the women then leave the workforce so that the men would have jobs. It was an interesting time to grow up because I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood, and it was a time when blue-collar workers, men, fathers, husbands, fathers, could work and support a family. And most mothers stayed home, although mine didn't. Mine was home for a little while, but then went back to work. I don't actually have a memory of her being a stay-at-home mom. My grandmother lived with us, though, and so I had a built-in primary caregiver in my grandmother. My grandmother was a very, very devout Mormon, believed everything about the church, and always pushed very hard for us to be active in the church. And she was really the driving force behind our church activities. And so I can remember when I was very young, before I went to school, she would go to Relief Society. My mother was at work, so she wasn't there, but Relief Society was during the day because, of course, the women were mostly at home. And so my grandmother she didn't drive, but she'd always she'd never learned to drive a car, but she'd get a ride, and we'd go over to Relief Society, and they had a nursery, and I can remember playing in the nursery, and then on work day, they'd be out quilting, and they'd come and get us from the nursery and feed us lunch, and I can remember playing underneath the quilting frames. And so one of the things that I think people should understand is that time of life, of growing up, was a time when women outside of the church and women inside the church both kind of did the same things. Most women were stay-at-home moms then. And so they were conforming to the gender roles that the church didn't even have to prescribe, because that's what women did. Women stayed home and took care of their families.
I was going to ask if your mom or grandma considered feminism at all, because Rosie the Riveter is now a feminist icon, but at the time, my guess is it's just what you did. It was just what you did, absolutely. And my mother, she enjoyed working. After the war, and when my dad came home, the men had the GI Bill. And my dad signed up for a course in electronics. But after he got it, he found that he wasn't really very interested in it. But my mother was. So she finished the course, and he got the certificate for it, but she got the knowledge.
And later she went to work for a little startup company that made guidance systems for intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs.
Yeah.
And she became an electronics technician. So she was working in sort of this male-dominated field for all of her life, really, all of her working life. And they started out, it was one of these little companies that started out in somebody's garage and then got in to be a bigger company. And then we were living in the San Fernando Valley. We lived in North Hollywood. I lived in the same house from the time I was about 5 months old until I was 12. When I was 8 or 9, her company moved down south from there, down to a place called Costa Mesa. And at that point, my parents bought a new home out in Buena Park. That's where Knott's Berry Farm is. It's not too far from Disneyland. And they moved there, but they kept their house in North Hollywood. And my grandmother stayed in North Hollywood, so I continued to go to elementary school there in North Hollywood until I graduated from the 6th grade. But my mom moved down to Buena Park, and my dad kind of went back and forth between the two places. But on weekends, I would go down to Buena Park most of the time and visit with my mom. And so I started establishing a new life where I was going to be once I got out of grade school. So anyway...
Any fun memories about being a member of the church, the Mormon church, back in the 40s and early 50s?
Well, not the 40s, because I was born in 47, so...
Well, okay, so your memories would be in the 50s.
Yeah, my memories are in the 50s.
Okay.
Yeah, we were in a ward. It was kind of an interesting ward. We lived in a very blue-collar area, and part of the ward took that in, kind of in the flatland down in the San Fernando Valley. But the ward also took in part of the Hollywood Hills. And so there were a lot of interesting people in our ward. They had sort of the I won't say poor folks, because we weren't poor, but the sort of middle-income people. And then up in the hills, on the Hollywood Hills, there were doctors and lawyers and people who were in show business. Some of the people...
Like Rosemary Reed, or...?
Rosemary Reed was not in the ward, but I can remember her being talked about. I think my grandmother might have known her. But we had 2 of the King sisters were in our ward. Lex Diazevedo is the son of one of the King sisters. He grew up in our ward, but he was older than me. He was closer to my brother's age. My brother's 6.5 years older than I am. So I didn't really know him. There was one of the other sisters had a girl who was my age and that I went through primary with. They did lots of things then. It was sort of the heyday for Relief Society in a lot of ways. The Relief Society, I can remember them putting on really pretty extravagant bazaars. And my mother...
What's a bazaar?
Okay, we don't even know that now. Well, the women would make things. They would make handicrafts. They would make... They'd cook things, baked goods and things, and then they would sell them, and that's how they raised the money to run the Relief Society, because it wasn't funded by the church then.
Wasn't correlated.
It was not correlated. And so they would have these big bazaars, and I can remember seeing things piled out on the tables that were for sale, and my mother and my grandmother both crocheted, and they would crochet things around the edges of handkerchiefs, for instance, and those were always pretty big sellers. My mother tatted, which was that
means something different now.
Yeah, right. But that was it's kind of a lost art at this point. I had her teach me how to do it, but a little bit, but I didn't have the patience for it. But that was very unique, and so we had some of the people in the ward who were wealthier, and they'd snap those things up really quickly. I can remember that, and then. Like I said, my brother was 6.5 years older than me. And so when he became a teenager, or when he was maybe 14, when he was 14, I was about 8. Now, this was a time of the baseball baptism era. And I think a lot of Mormons today have heard of the baseball baptisms as a missionary tool over in England, for instance. Interestingly, There was an article about baseball baptisms in Sunstone, probably in the early 90s. And
Michael Quinn.
yeah. Well, in that article, it talked about a missionary who helped to get that started, and his name was Galen Grover. Well, it turned out that at that time, Galen Grover was my bishop when the article came out. And he knew I subscribed to Sunstone, so he asked to borrow it, because I guess someone had told him about the article, and he read it. And he told me, he read it, and then he said, I never had a single baptism that came from baseball. He said, I just wanted to play baseball. And so other people took that and ran with it. But so I think people who've heard of that era have thought about that as something that they did just for missionaries, but they may have missed the point that baseball program, that sports program that they had in the church, also was going on and holding on to young men through their teenage years, through the organized athletic leagues within the church. My brother was an outstanding softball pitcher. Eventually, he pitched on a semi-pro team. So the Studio City Ward had one of the very best softball teams in the whole church, and each summer for a number of years, they would go to Salt Lake and play in the all-church softball tournament. And my brother pitched all the way to the championships, to the championship game of 2 years.
So across state lines, they would have
state lines.
a championship that filtered all the way to Salt Lake City.
Correct. So they would play within the stake, and then the teams that won the stake would play within the region. They would have a double elimination tournament within the region, and then the winning team would go to Salt Lake and have a tournament there.
How fun.
It was a lot of fun, and I was the bat girl.
Oh.
So I took care of the balls and the bats and shagged balls when they did batting practice, and my dad was the coach. So although my parents were not overly obsessive about making sure that we got to our meetings, we did go to meetings, because one of the requirements for these young men who were playing softball, and they had junior and senior leagues. They had junior leagues that went from the time they were probably starting in junior high, or at least by the time they were 14 until they were 18. And then they had senior leagues where the adult men played. And so they would, I kind of lost my train of thought there, but in order to be on the teams, they had to go to church. And I think they had to attend like 2 sacrament meetings a month or something like that. There was a church attendance requirement in order for them to be there. And sometimes they had non-member kids that were their friends who would come and play. I know my brother had a couple of good friends that were not LDS, but they also came to church so they could play on the softball team. So that's just another aspect of what we've thought of as the baseball baptisms that also kept young men within the church.
So did you have, do you remember primary? I think soccer meeting would have been split out from...
Yes, we didn't have a block back then. So we would every week we'd go to Sunday school, and that was always in the morning. And we had a building where we didn't share a building for most of the time that I was growing up. And so we'd go to Sunday school in the morning, and then unless it was Fast Sunday, we'd go home, and then later in the afternoon we would have sacrament meeting. And we didn't always make it back to sacrament meeting.
So your grandma let you skip?
Yeah, she did. She always went, I think. I think I probably went most of the time, but I didn't always go.
If you had to think about the church in 2017 versus the church in the 1950s and 60s, were there some major differences that come to mind, just in terms of how it felt, what the experience was like, what the leadership was like, how the culture felt? It's kind of putting you on the spot.
It's a little bit hard to think of, because I experienced it as a child and now I'm an adult.
Yeah, sure.
So I think I've seen things change over the years. And one of the things, people had huge, immense regard for David O. McKay.
He was there in the 50s? He was your prophet
yes,
in the 50s?
I think I was about 3 or 4, I think I was 3 when he became the president of the church. And although we certainly thought of him as prophet, seer, and revelator, I don't really remember people talking about him so much as the prophet or following the prophet. I remember him being talked about as President McKay. And I think that one of the things that has evolved is the amount of reverence we give to the top leaders of the church. And it's not that, I mean, people loved and respected the leaders of the church back then, but I don't think they sort of deified them quite as much as they do now.
So leader worship.
Yeah, at least that's my sense of things. And again, I was just a child, so I can't say for sure, but that's really my sense. And I kind of noticed that growing as I was growing up. Maybe I just became more aware of it. But of course, this was the uncorrelated church also.
Right.
But I wasn't really old enough to notice too much how correlation. But by the time correlation came along, I was certainly aware of what was happening. But in the uncorrelated church, that was just sort of how it was. So I wasn't thinking about that. There's a set of things that we believed. I learned the articles of faith in primary. In primary, we had the boys and girls were together until 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And at that point, they had a divergent path. And the boys, I'm not really sure what the boys did in their program. The girls had kind of a homemaker path. And we were I think the bluebirds, and then we were the meadowlarks, and then we were the seagulls.
I've never heard of those.
Yeah.
I heard of Mary Miss.
Right, Mary Miss came along later. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we had these bandolos. They were made out of felt. They had one for the boys and one for the girls. The boys wore theirs down in a, bumped the microphone, sorry, in a V, and the girls wore theirs over the shoulder, as I recall. And there were things that you did, requirements, praying, reading the scriptures, helping people, things like that. And when you accomplished learning the articles of faith, when you accomplished that, they gave you this little plastic thing that you would put onto this felt bandolo. And so I earned all of those. I remember that when I was in the 6th grade, I think it was, they had us do this cross-stitch sampler. And it had this motto for each of the years that we were in this girls' part of the primary. And the first one, I think, was greet the day with a song. Maybe the meadowlarks were first, because I think that was the meadowlarks. Greet the day with a song, make others happy, and serve gladly. So we did that in a cross-stitch. And for each of those years, there was one of those themes. And my mom still has mine. It's hanging on her wall.
I want to see a picture.
Oh,
will you send us a picture?
I will send you a picture.
Okay.
I will be happy to do that.
I want to put that in the post.
Yeah.
That'd be fun.
I can definitely do that.
Do you remember, was it called Young Men's, Young Women's? Was it called Mutual? It's called Mutual.
It was the Mutual Improvement Association, but it was shortened to Mutual.
What was Mutual Improvement Association?
Well, that started when you were about
12?
Well, 12, yeah, probably at age 12, when you start 7th grade and went through high school.
What was it?
Well, it was kind of like Young Men's and Young Women's now. So we met on a weeknight, and again, there was no block, so they didn't have a meeting on Sunday. And so they would meet on a weeknight, and I wasn't real active in Mutual. I went when I was a beehive. And I had a teacher in beehives who was I'm not sure she had any children of her own. If she did, they were grown. But she was very dedicated to the beehives. And I can remember her coming over to my house and talking to me and going over the beehive manual. There was another bandolo. It was bigger. and again, you could do you had choices of things you could do to earn these little plastic awards that they put on the bandolo. And I didn't really earn very many of them. I think maybe a lot of them had to do with things that didn't interest me very much. The one I specifically remember earning was one where I took care of the yard and mowed the lawn and things like that. I kind of always enjoyed doing outdoorsy things.
So do you remember, like, did they have dances, ward dances, stake dances?
They did. They had some ward dances and they had some stake dances. And
did you go to those, or were you not super active as a youth?
Well, when they did things on Mutual Night, for my first couple of years as a beehive, I was active, and then when I was a my maid, I really wasn't active as a my maid. And then I kind of got active again when I was.
Except it wasn't my maid.
I was a Laurel, I think. Yeah, it was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was the my maids. It was the beehives, and then the my maids, and I think it was the Laurels.
Okay.
And so yeah, I did that.
Was there a reason why you weren't as active? Was it because your parents weren't that into it?
Okay. First, we had moved out. By that time I'd moved out to Buena Park. And my grandmother stayed in North Hollywood. So I didn't have that driving force of
Grandma
keeping.
Wasn't around.
Grandma wasn't there. And then the other thing was, once I lived in Buena Park with my mom, a lot of times on weekends I would go back to North Hollywood to see my grandma. And then if I went to church, I went to church with her rather than in the ward in Buena Park. Now, I have one interesting thing that I have to tell about my ward in Buena Park.
All right.
We had one of the counselors in the bishopric was Brother Hofmann. And
so Mark Hofmann?
Mark Hoffman's father.
I think of him as Salt Lake City, not as California.
Yeah, he grew up in the Buena Park Second Ward. Now, I didn't know him. He was a few years younger than me. And you know, when you're a teenage girl, you're probably not very interested in the 10-year-old boys. So right. I didn't know him, and it's not like we were close with the family or anything. But his father was in the bishopric, and I think I remember reading that he kind of started his forgery stuff when he was a teenager. He took a dime and put a D. It was a 1914 dime, and the 1914 D dime. I was a coin collector as a kid. Mm-hmm. 1914 D was a very valuable coin. I think he somehow put a D onto a dime and was able to fool some coin some people that knew what they were doing and looked at coins. And I think he was fairly young. I don't know if he did that while I would have been gone by that time. So I don't know if he did it when I think I heard it was when he was a teenager.
Okay.
Late teens. And then he was doing stuff when he went on his mission. He was over in England. But anyway, just to be a name dropper. Okay.
So, in your teen years, developing your testimony, I assume there was seminary?
Yeah, so...
What was seminary like?
When I only went to seminary the whole year for 1 year. But when I went into ninth grade, I went into high school, I started seminary. The seminary teacher came around and recruited me to go to seminary, and it was Book of Mormon year. And so I signed up for seminary. It was early morning seminary, of course. And I also, my first year of high school, signed up for the swim team, which was every day after school, 4 days a week, and it was exhausting. And so after a couple weeks, I decided something had to give, and what gave was seminary. But when I started seminary, they gave us this big Book of Mormon. It was a big, probably like 10 inches tall by 6 inches or something. And it was probably the first Book of Mormon where they started putting in the Arnold Freeberg pictures. And then it had a bunch of pictures in from Latin America of ruins down there, and talking about the Latin America as the Book of Mormon lands. And I can remember that for the first couple weeks or a month or so when I did go to seminary, I can remember the teacher talking about Latin America as being the place where the Book of Mormon peoples were. So when I quit going, it wasn't any reason, it wasn't lack of interest, because I really was kind of interested in religion and in learning about the Book of Mormon, but I was just so tired doing swim team and early Mormon morning seminary that I just couldn't do it. And they came around, they tried to recruit me back in and kind of did the guilt trip thing. But But my mom she let me decide if I wanted to go. And once I made the decision, at that point, she stopped anybody from putting any further pressure on me to go. And so at that point, I kind of got, so I wasn't as active in the church anymore. But again, I was still going to church over in the other...
With Grandma.
With Grandma, yeah. And my brother was, by this time, an adult, and he was still playing softball with the church team for a while longer. So I was still kind of active with that. So we still had plenty of church ties. It wasn't necessarily in the ward that I was in. And so I didn't make friends as much there.
So do you remember your testimony growing as a teenager?
Yes, I do. And even though I wasn't necessarily going to church in my ward, I was really kind of always interested in religion topics. So when I was, I think, when Kennedy was killed.
63.
63. And what I wanted to do that Sunday was go to church. By this time I had a car also. So
You'd have been about 16?
I was 16, yeah. And that's where I wanted to be that Sunday. And I went by myself. The whole America...
What did you feel when he got killed? What did that feel
devastating, like? Devastating.
Would your parents have been Democrats? Would they have voted for him?
They were Democrats. I'm not. I think they voted for him, but I'm not certain.
Okay.
But I was. It's one of those times you remember exactly where you were and what you were doing. And I was in my Algebra 2 class, and the school had this PA system where the principal could come on and talk to the class. And before it came on, you could hear 2 electronic clicks up in the speakers. And the whole class heard it, but the teacher was talking. He didn't. He kept on talking, and the class shushed him. And then the principal came on and said, "We've been hearing news reports, and it's been confirmed by the police that the president riding in a motorcade in Dallas has been shot." At that point, they didn't know he was dead. They said shot and taken to the hospital, I think is what he said. And then they came on later and told us, and it was just gloom over everybody. It was just really a horribly emotional time. And then that was a Thursday, I think, and then they didn't have school the next day. And America was just glued to the television.
You're still emotional about it.
Yeah, if I talk about it, yeah.
What did he mean to you? Or what did that event mean to you?
I think that it was a kind of feeling of I knew that there were assassinations in American history, but it seemed like that could never happen anymore. That we didn't do that anymore. Now we're beyond that. We've moved. We're a peaceful society, and that's something like that's not going to happen anymore.
So it made you feel...
So it was a loss of innocence, I think. So anyway, I went to church that Sunday, and I think that it was after that I started going to church more, and
what would make you want to go to church because of that event?
I don't know. I think I just wanted to be with my religious community and pray, and be comforted.
I would think it would make you feel sad but insecure and unstable. Like the world was coming apart.
Yeah, it did kind of feel like that. Yeah. And so, anyway, by that time, I was kind of being more interested in church anyway, but I definitely wanted to be there then. And I started just reading more about religion, reading the Bible more. I can't remember for sure, but I think I may have gone to seminary part of that year. But I didn't go for the whole year until we did New Testament. So, but I did start reading more and thinking more about religion and studying more. And that was when one day I wrote a Sunstone paper about this, and I'd like to just kind of read part of it. The Sunstone paper was in 1997. But I had thought about this all the time since I had this experience. And so I'm just going to read the first part of this. When I was about 16 years old, I got angry with God, and I told him off for the first time in my life. To say I was angry is to substantially understate my feelings of outrage at the time. I was, in a word, incensed. What triggered my angry outburst at God was my attempt to come to grips with the atonement. I had grown up knowing about Jesus' passion and crucifixion and resurrection, and I didn't much question the veracity of the ideas that Jesus was the Son of God and the Savior. But that night I had lain in bed reading some long since forgotten Mormon commentary on the Bible. I don't remember what the book said or who wrote it, but I suppose it contained a graphic description of Jesus' suffering in Gethsemane, and probably quoted section 19 of the Doctrine and Covenants, in which Joseph Smith relates the description of that suffering. Although the concept of Jesus' suffering as atoning was not new to me, it was not until that moment that I tried to make any sense of it. Had I been older and more experienced and more theologically sophisticated in my reasoning, I think I might have dismissed the commentator's concept of atonement out of hand as too bizarre to give credence to. Lacking such theological sophistication, I suddenly saw Jesus' suffering not only as excruciating beyond comprehension, but also as both unjust and pointless, and I imagined the God who would have inflicted such suffering on his only begotten and innocent Son could only be sadistic and evil. What kind of a supreme being would intentionally design his creation in a way in which he could only reconcile us to himself through the unimaginable suffering that I assumed he deliberately visited on the good and kind and loving friend that I believed Jesus to be? As I contemplated the overwhelming injustice of what I thought I understood about the atonement, I became furious at God. In my mind, I screamed at him, telling him how evil I thought he was. I can't remember the words I used. Though I wasn't a swearing person, I may have sworn at him. I may have told him where to go, or that I had only contempt and could never love or serve such an evil being. I guess I knew that one should not address the deity in the manner in which I did. But my sense of justice was so thoroughly offended at that moment, I didn't care what this evil God thought of me. I wanted nothing to do with him. And if he chose to smite me, well, that would only prove that what I already thought about him was true. After a few minutes of raging at God, I mentally fell silent, not because my feeling of fury had abated, but because I had no words left to further express my outrage. Still, even without words, I raged, I fumed, and finally I wept, tears of anger and pain and frustration over my utter helplessness in the face of God's desolating injustice. At that moment, a most remarkable thing happened. Into the silent space of my mind, created by my loss of expression, came a peaceful, comforting presence, and I heard the words spoken gently to my mind. Wait, stop. It's not like what you think. Be patient. Someday you'll understand. My anger quickly dissipated under a feeling of tender reassurance of God's love. I remember feeling at the time that I might never fully understand the atonement in this life, but that I should just have faith and trust God, and if I couldn't fully understand, maybe it didn't really matter. Still, I've sought over the years to make sense of Jesus' suffering and how it brings about atonement, reconciliation, and wholeness within ourselves and between ourselves and others and God. Now, this is a paper that I did at Sunstone in April of 1997, and I think I'd maybe like to read the rest of it later on after I get to the buildup of what caused me to write this paper.
Was this paper a really important part of your life?
That experience was an important part of my life.
Right. Okay.
It was an important part of my developing a sense of being a Christian, of being devoted to Jesus, and I didn't really have. I mean, like most kids, I didn't really understand all of the things that the church taught about that, and I didn't see a lot of difference between what Mormons believed and what the larger Christian world believed. I had a lot of friends who were Christian, although I didn't have a lot of Mormon friends because down there like my seminary class was spread out over probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 wards. And most of the kids went to a different school than I did. A few went to my school, but they tended not to be in the same kind of classes and have the same schedule that I did. So most of my friends were not Mormon, but I did have, Mormon standards, and a lot of, some of the friends that I chose were other Christians, and so I heard a lot about the kinds of things they believed too, and I didn't make a lot of distinction between their beliefs about Christ and mine. And I even, when I was getting up and going to seminary, then I was awake early, and there was quite a bit of time between seminary and when school started, and there was a group that formed called Youth for Christ, and some of my friends went to that, and they invited me to come with them. And they would meet at a church near the school, right in that middle period when I didn't have anything else to do anyway. And they would have a local minister come and talk to them, and I learned things from going about how other people understood Christianity, and they would tend to unlike in Mormonism, they would tend to choose a biblical text and develop that. And I really learned quite a bit about the Bible from listening to them. And then sometimes they didn't really do an altar call, but they would invite people to accept Christ into their heart, and they'd have a prayer and invite you to accept Christ, and say, I remember one of the ministers saying, now if you've let Christ, invited Christ into your heart, would you just look up so that I can see that you've done that? And I could remember thinking about that and thinking that I already had. I didn't need to do that because I already had this relationship with Christ, and so I didn't see that what my friends were doing were really any different than what I had learned as a Mormon. Another thing that I remember doing one time when I was a teenager, about that same age, maybe 16, 17, is I think the teacher, it's probably in the New Testament class, and he was probably talking about the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament that related to Christ. And I decided I was going to go home and look at them. Now, the church didn't have its own version of the scriptures at that point. We had a standard Protestant Bible, and it was cross-referenced in the margins to, like, if there was a prophecy, if in Matthew, if it says, so that and so it was fulfilled as was written, and then it would quote something in the Old Testament, and then in the margin it would say where that was. So one day I decided to look up those scriptures from the Old Testament. And what I remember thinking was, I'd go back and read the Old Testament passage, and I'd think, if I were a Jew back then, I don't think I'd make this connection between this being a prophecy of Christ to come. Because there might be some words that worked, but when you read the context of the scripture, it just didn't work so well anymore. Like, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. Well, I didn't know back then that the word in Hebrew wasn't virgin, it was young woman, that came from the Septuagint. But I went back and read that. Okay, well, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. That seems like a pretty good prophecy of Christ. But then I read the rest of the chapter, and I couldn't relate anything else in that chapter to anything I'd ever read in the New Testament. So I wasn't negating those as prophecies of Christ, but I had a hard time really making the connection. And then I read in the Book of Mormon. And in the Book of Mormon, you've got specific prophecies from 600 BC about a virgin conceiving, and they're very specific. Well, that stuff's easy to write if you're writing it in 1830. But if you're writing it 600 years before Christ, how can that be this specific? And I remember asking my seminary teacher at that point, why is it that these prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament are so vague, but in the Book of Mormon, they're so specific? And he said, well, the people in the Book of Mormon were more righteous. But I remember thinking, they don't seem that righteous. Maybe you've got a righteous prophet, but the people, I mean, why are these people getting such specific stuff when the Jews over there in the Holy Lands are not? Another thing that I remember from those years in terms of my developing ideas about religion was there was a radio program on Sunday nights. I think it was called Clergy on the Line. And there was this minister who would come, and it was a call-in show, so people could call and ask him about specific scriptures, but when nobody was calling, he'd just talk about it in general. And one night, he talked about Adam and Eve. And he explained that there were two creation stories in Genesis, which I hadn't really ever noticed before. And he talked about the concept of religious myth. And he said a myth isn't something that's just made up and untrue. A myth is a story that tells us something about our own life and that helps us to think about life and the way we relate to the world. And I love that concept. That was awesome. I thought, I knew we didn't have DNA to test. We couldn't recreate the chain of life on this planet the same way then as we do now. But I'd certainly been in the museums. I'd seen the skulls. I knew that people evolved, and I wasn't really clear on how literal the church was about Adam and Eve. But I remember hearing that story, and it was just. It was just enlightening and sort of freeing in some ways to think, I can see this in a new way, and I don't have to take it literally. And I just loved that idea right from the time I was like 16 or 17. And it gave me a new way of looking at religion. And I think a way that ultimately helped me come to grips with a lot of the conflict that I had and that I learned as a Mormon.
Now, I have to note that most teenagers are thinking about their hair, what they're wearing, who they're dating. They're not thinking a lot about the full implications of a particular piece of theology or of a particular scripture, right?
Yeah, I think that's true.
So what, do you think that's just the way you were made? Was there something in your earlier years that made you take words and stories and teachings really seriously? Do you think that was from your parents, from your grandma, is that just the chemicals in your brain? What do you think?
It's probably a lot of things. I think my grandmother probably had a lot to do with it. When I was little, we had a little children's book of Bible stories. She always used to read to me at night before I'd go to bed. And I liked hearing the Bible stories, so I'd ask her to read those to me. Now, why I particularly liked them, I don't know, but I can't really put my finger on that. But I do remember having a lot of interest in that. And I always enjoyed going to church. Even when I didn't go to church, it wasn't because of any animosity toward church. It was just for some reason I didn't go. But I really did enjoy going to Sunday school and primary and all those things. And I don't know, we were talking before we started, I'm kind of introverted and I think about things. And so I think I just had given things a lot of thought myself, but I can't really put my finger on any one reason why I was interested. And I was interested in all those other things. It's not like I sat around thinking about these things all the time. Because
sure.
I did other stuff too. But I was a good student, and the bulk of my time was devoted to studying and learning and going to school.
So did these things rattle your faith, or would you have, do you look back and think of yourself as having been a pretty orthodox, believing member?
Yeah, I was probably a pretty orthodox believing member, as much as you can be when you're a teenager and you haven't you haven't gone through a correlated program. I think religious instruction for young people now is different because of correlation. I mean, we had courses of study, but you know, back then, I think Sunday school manuals were being written by people like Lowell Bennion, not by the correlation committee.
Right.
I think that they. I think they focused, on O.C. Tanner, all those people. And I think that the lessons tended to focus probably more on living a good life and having, they were not as indoctrinating, let me put it that way,
sure,
as I think they are now.
Sure. Talk about your BYU years if you want.
Okay, so I graduated from high school and I went to BYU. And when I went off to BYU, I had lots of ambition for finishing my college years. I wasn't sure just exactly what I wanted to be, but I really wanted to be a good student and I wanted to graduate. And then I got to BYU and I got indoctrinated more into role acceptance.
Was that a different culture? Was BYU in the 60s? Yeah. What year would you have started BYU?
I started in the fall of 1965.
So that's right after the Beatles had come to America. Mm-hmm. Beatlemania was sweeping the country.
It was.
It was kind of pre-hippie years. Which
reminds me, speaking of that, another thing I didn't talk about was roadshows.
Yes.
We did roadshows back in the 60s, and the reason I thought of that is because one year, I think it was probably my senior year in high school, the people who wrote the roadshow for our ward did a Beatles, a play on the Beatles, and they took some of the Beatles music, and I can remember somebody having one of their wigs and singing "We Love You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah," and shaking her head, or his head, I guess it was.
In a roadshow.
In a roadshow, yeah. and I mean, okay, so they had roadshows, they had softball, they had dances, This was a time, the baby boomer years were a time when the whole society focused on children. When I was in grade school, there were so many children coming into the schools. They had to, they brought in portable classrooms because they had too many kids. They put us on half-day sessions while they built more schools. We had 30 kids in a class. In fact, one year I had 40 kids in a class for a while. And the whole world focused around young people, and the church did too. And mothers were not working, and they were putting all their energy into all of these church activities. And you can't recreate that today because people's lives aren't like that. But back then, there were all these talented, bright women who were focusing their attentions on their children and their church work. And we don't have that kind of manpower and woman power anymore in today's society. But back then we did. So in that sense, it was a great time to grow up because you had the whole society so focused on young people.
You know, that's an interesting point because I tended to sort of, in a really simplified way, even my childhood was very similar, and I grew up in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. But when I think about a lot of that having gone away or at least becoming diluted, I think it's been easy in my mind to just blame the leaders, blame correlation. But it sounds like a big driver of the change is just society's changed.
Well, it is, except that society changed and the church didn't. And when they brought in correlation, they pushed us back into that 1950s and 60s model in terms of gender roles.
Which you enjoyed, right?
As a child, I did.
Yeah, right.
As an adult, I didn't like it so much.
Okay. Yeah, it's fun for the kid, not so much for the adult.
For the kids.
So it wasn't super fun for your mom or grandma, you're saying?
Well, my grandma was in that role because she was staying home and taking care of us. My mother, I think, liked to work. I don't think she had anything against she loves to do lots of things at home, but she also enjoyed her work.
Yeah.
And so I kind of had this dual model. I had my stay-at-home grandma and my working mom.
Traditional grandma, working mom.
Yeah. And there was some conflict about that. My grandmother was quite critical of my mother for working, actually. And I thought she was wrong about that. I thought it was cool that my mom worked, and I was proud of my mom and of what she did, and I wanted to do stuff like that. In fact, I said she was an electronics technician. One thing she did at her job is they would build their test equipment. They ordered what were called Heath kits. I don't even know if Heath kits are still around, but they came in a kit with all the stuff you put together, and she taught me how to read the codes on resistors and capacitors. She taught me how to read electronic schematics. She taught me how to solder. I built lots of test equipment.
That is cool.
It was cool.
You
and
know
I
how to
loved
solder?
doing it. Oh, absolutely. I make a really good, clean solder joint.
I love that.
Yes, and I was good at it. I could follow the directions, and I could put everything in just right and do a really good job.
Okay, so when you went to BYU, you had grown up in this sort of mixed, traditional, non-traditional home.
Right.
And then BYU was like what? I mean, that's Wilkinson.
Wilkinson,
You're right
absolutely.
there.
Yeah. I was completely unaware of like the BYU spy ring. I guess that was going on while I was there, but it was totally under my radar.
But that would have been Cold War and sort of full throttle. Ezra Taft Benson.
Absolutely.
Ezra Taft Benson's running around doing John Bircher stuff.
Yes, and I was aware of the John Bircher stuff when I was in Southern California. There were people who were John Birchers. And I can remember even it being on television. I remember some John Bircher going on the TV and taking a lie detector test over whether or not he truly believed that Eisenhower was a communist dupe. And he passed the lie detector test. He really believed it. And they pointed out that doesn't mean Eisenhower is a dupe, a communist dupe, but it means this guy believes it.
And do you remember Cleon Skousen's writings and Ezra Taft Benson's writings? And
I remember that I didn't ever read them. I remember that they were around, though. None dare call it treason, and what were the others?
Conspiracy also.
Yeah. It was all about that conspiracy stuff.
Naked Communist.
Naked Communist. Yeah, I remember that. I remember all those.
And so, what was the zeitgeist at the BYU campus in the mid '60s? Like,
I would say it was very orthodox.
Was it like Leave It to Beaver?
I think a lot of things about it were like Leave It to Beaver. And certainly
sweaters, sweaters, and like.
It was a little late for poodles.
Pop.
Poodle skirts were a little earlier than that, but yeah, soda pop. Of course, no Coke without caffeine.
Yeah.
I lived in Helaman Halls.
Which hall?
Budge.
Budge Hall.
I lived in Budge Hall. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and my, while I was at BYU, I took a Book of Mormon class, and there was this. It was taught by this young, mid-20s graduate student by the name of Jeffrey Holland.
So I took Book of Mormon from him when he was president of BYU.
Really?
I didn't realize he had taught Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
As a grad student, or?
Yeah, I guess he was a grad student.
Pre-Yale, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Probably CES?
I don't know. I would not have been attuned
to that. Was he good?
He was a good teacher. I really enjoyed his class a lot. I think my most memorable memory of him teaching class was when he taught us about Adam and Eve. And I already talked about Adam and Eve. I was, at this point, I was ready to think of Adam and Eve as this wonderful myth that tells us about how sin separates us from God, and how sin contributed to male dominance over women, because we were equal before, and then after the fall, then Adam dominates Eve, and Eve gets cursed. And
why did you need Adam and Eve to be mythical for you?
Well, because as a literal story, I don't like it that well.
You didn't
back
then?
Happens.
Back then you didn't like it?
No, I really didn't.
So it wasn't Age of the Earth stuff?
It was partly that. It was partly Age of the Earth stuff, and partly that I didn't really like the story that well. I could see it as subordination of women.
So you had feminist awakenings.
Yeah, I wouldn't have
way
called
back
myself
then.
a feminist, but I certainly was developing that consciousness. I remember in 1962, I think it was, when I was just probably beginning high school. I remember going to the store one day, and there was a book rack, and there was this book, and it was called The Feminin Mystique.
Yes, who wrote that?
Betty Friedan.
Right.
And I picked it up, and I read the cover. But I was just a kid, and I was busy going to school. But I kind of was vaguely aware that there was some change going on about women's roles.
Right.
But I wasn't into it in any sense. So at BYU, I kind of just fell into place into the idea of the Mormon role of women. But anyway, I was going to finish telling you what Jeff Holland said. So he talked about Adam and Eve as real people, and as he said that when they came to the earth, they were unmortal, and I never heard that word before. He said they were not immortal, because immortal is what happens after we die and we're resurrected, but they weren't yet mortal either, and they were unmortal. And I remember him saying they ate the fruit, and my understanding of what he was saying was that they ate the fruit, and that's what degraded their bodies and made them.
I remember that.
Yeah.
There's something chemical in the fruit.
They ate the fruit is what caused their bodies to become mortal and subject to death.
Yeah, that's Joseph Fielding Smith kind of stuff.
I think it is Joseph
Doctrines
Fielding.
of Salvation.
It probably is. I don't. Yeah, it might be, but
And that would have been
I'd
right-
never heard that before.
Yeah.
And it was a much more literal reading of Adam and Eve than I kind of had going in my mind. And then I went over to my geology class, where the age of the Earth was, 3.5 billion years old. I mean, 4.5 billion years old.
Right.
And so I had this kind of conflict between what was going on in Book of Mormon class and what was going on in geology class.
Yeah. What was that like? Was that challenging to your testimony?
No,
or?
it wasn't challenging to my testimony, but it was, I had to hold two different ideas in my mind at the same time. It probably created a little cognitive dissonance. I didn't have that term back then, but it probably did. Yeah.
Okay.
And so anyway, I met my husband. We were in the same ward, and my first year we were in the same ward, and we dated, and then we kind of split up, and then we dated again, and then we got engaged, and and so I went to BYU for 3 semesters. I had started my 4th semester, and he got a job up in Idaho. He hadn't graduated, but he needed to not be in school anymore for a while. And so he got a job up in Idaho at the Argonne National Laboratory out on the desert, part of the Atomic Energy Commission, working on what they called an experimental breeder reactor, where they were trying to get, as I understand it, trying to get radioactive fuel to kind of, I don't know, replicate itself. I mean, to make it so that it could continue to make more fuel for the reactor. Anyway, he got a job out there, and we went up. We got married in the Idaho Falls Temple, and we lived there I lived in Ammon, which is right outside of Idaho Falls, and then we moved into town and bought a house. We had our first baby, which was Laura, and then he took a couple classes that were offered there at there was no college there, but he took a couple classes that were extension classes, and then he needed to go back to BYU to finish his degree. And so I was 7 months pregnant and had a child that was not yet 2, and we went back to BYU and spent 1 year there with him finishing up his degree.
And it sounds like your degree kind of didn't matter.
Yeah.
Talk about that for a second.
Yeah. Well, at BYU, I kind of got the impression that it didn't matter, that my job in life was to be a wife and a mother and a homemaker, and I was young and in love, and that was okay.
So you weren't tormented by that?
I was not tormented by it, but I was irritated by the way the church talked about women. Mm-hmm. that was their only role in life, because this is what I wanted to do now. When I was only 19 when I got married. And when I was 19 and 20 and I had little kids, that was what I wanted to do. But it wasn't what I wanted to do always.
Right.
And I knew I had a future that was going to be different than that. And so at the end of the school year, when he graduated, he went for the full year, so the fall, winter, and summer, all 3 semesters, and then he graduated. And he graduated in 70, 69? It must have been 1970. There was a major, major recession in the economy. He sent out 250 resumes and got 8 people back who wanted him to fill out an application.
Oh my goodness.
And he got 1 job offer. And that was at Lockheed in Sunnyvale, California. And I had always heard that was a really nice place to live, so I was really excited about going there. And so we did go to, he took that job at Lockheed, and we lived there from 1970 until he retired in 1998. And that's where we raised our family.
All right. Well, I think this is a natural point to stop for part 1 of our interview. So we've kind of taken you through your early childhood, your teen years, and through BYU into early adulthood. And so far it's been a really fun context to discuss, to then jump into sort of what, I don't know, I guess I would say your intellectual awakening. I mean, it sounds like you're always intellectually awake, but you weren't, I don't know, it didn't occur to you to sort of start pushing in some of the areas you pushed.
Right.
But something woke you up even more, and I think that's what episode 2 is going to be about.
I think so.
Is that right?
Good to me. Yes,
All
definitely.
right. So those of you listening live, we really want, on Mormon Stories Live, we really want to hear your comments or questions for Nadine. I'll just read a couple. Laura Polson wrote, "Thanks for the opportunity to get to know you, Nadine, better. I know our Southern Utah group is lucky to have you as a resource." Donna writes, "This is so fascinating, Nadine. Thank you for sharing your life experiences with all of us." Soraya wrote, "Yay for STEM women." I think she's talking about your mom's science, technology, education, and math.
Oh, okay.
It's basically women
Yeah.
who are caring about the sciences.
That's good.
Julie also writes, "Love hearing your stories." Joyce wrote, "I remember her teacher crying as she told us about JFK." So those are just some of the comments coming in. We want to encourage Mormon Stories Live listeners to keep making comments or questions, but I want to thank everyone for tuning in for part 1, and please don't miss parts 2, 3, and wherever else we go, because this is going to get even more epic. So email us at mormonstories@gmail.com, make comments up at mormonstories.org, and thanks for joining us, and we'll come back very soon for part 2.
Okay.
Thanks, Nadine.
Okay.